Well, good morning. Welcome to our Cosmic Conversations here on the Morrison Planetarium Facebook page. My name is Ryan White. I'm the Senior Director of Morrison Planetarium and Science Visualization at the California Academy of Sciences. And today it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Nick Kanas joining us. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And unlike most of the doctors we have on the Cosmic Conversations, you actually have an MD. And usually we talk to astronomers with PhDs, but you actually are what people often think of as a doctor. And Nick graduated from Stanford, went on to medical school at UCLA, and is now Professor Emeritus from the University of California, San Francisco. And among other things, Nick studied how humans respond to space, not just physiologically, but psychologically. And so that's one of the topics that we wanted to talk about today. So again, thanks for joining us. And what actually got you into this topic, or how did you get engaged with this study of sort of psychology of astronauts and cosmonauts?
Well, I'm sort of a space cadet. I started very early reading science fiction, and when Sputnik went up, I went out to look at Sputnik, and a fellow had a telescope there. So I got my first look at Saturn through a telescope. So I became an amateur astronomer at the age of 12 and got a telescope myself, and kind of kept observing and moved along in life, always interested in space. And when I went to medical school, I decided I'm going to go that route and be a psychiatrist. I realized I could study psychiatric issues and psychological issues in space. So as a professor, I did some research in some medical areas, including group therapy, but I had the opportunity then to submit and do a grant with NASA to study psychiatric and psychological issues and interpersonal issues in astronauts. So that led to about 15 years where we were funded here in our lab to study astronauts on the Mir and the International Space Station.
So you would actually then interview astronauts, or
how did
that work?
We had 30 astronaut and cosmonaut subjects and almost 200 mission control subjects. We studied people in space and people on the ground. And I had collaborators from Russia that helped with enormously, not only in some of the language issues, but also in just doing the science. So we had 15 years of that, and it was a lot of fun. I got to interview and see a lot of astronauts and mission control folks, and saw some launches. It was a great opportunity.
That's great. Well, so we're going to travel into space virtually, at least, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about the International Space Station. But since we did mention your expertise, it would also be worth mentioning that you've actually written a book about this, Humans in Space. So if people are really interested and want to dig deeper, this would seem like a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, yeah, the International Space Station, this is sort of as far as humans travel out into space these days, a few hundred miles or a few hundred kilometers above Earth. But to get a sense of scale, I mean, we usually talk about the overall size of the space station as being about the length of a football field. But of course, the living space is even more cramped. So how much space do the astronauts actually have to move around?
Well, it depends on which module you're in. Some are more jammed with science and experiment and computers than others that are more the living space. But I like to say that one of those modules is about the size of a big school bus. And they have several they can go to. So if they want to get away a little bit, they can go to another module and look at the Earth or do other things. There's several of them on board. Some are related to science versus living, and some are owned by countries. So they do. There are people that visit from their country, go and visit and stay in that module.
But limited opportunities for social distancing.
It's not too bad, though. It's certainly much better than the old Apollo and some of the earlier modules. There's enough space around that you can get away if you want to be private.
Well, maybe we could start by talking about some of the stresses and stressors that people experience in space.
Okay, yeah, there's microgravity, and then there's danger, and there's a number of physical stressors. But the psychological stressors, first involving individual people, are things like being isolated from home, being confined in sometimes a busy space like you see in this slide,
Right.
where a couple astronauts are doing tasks at the same time. There's danger. A micrometeoroid could hit your ship, or you could have problems with different components. If you want to look at the next slide, I think we had a picture of the arm. Let's see, there it is. You can imagine being perched at the end of that. This is
Right.
the Canadian arm, and you see an astronaut on the right of the screen. He's tethered and he's there, but you never know what will happen. So it can be kind of harrowing as an experience.
Right.
Also, I mentioned you work together as a team, but sometimes you work alone. So you have to be able not only to get along with people and to socialize, but also, like in this slide here, to be on your own. Here's an astronaut working with a camera and do a project for hours on end by yourself. That's also a skill. So you have to have ability to do that. The stress can vary. It can be really busy, especially around launching, around docking, and around spacewalks, or kind of quiet, like the next slide. You have some downtime, and here's a fellow playing the guitar. He got himself into a space where he wanted to be alone and play, and so he's having at it, which helps a lot. There's also the issue of time. This is a little bit of a complicated area. Our missions were 4 to 7 months, and in that period, we didn't find a big impact of time, but some people do find that after the halfway point, it's stressful for people. They get to the halfway point and they say, "Wow, halfway through my mission," and they say,
interesting.
"I've got another half to go."
Right.
And so there are reports occasionally of people getting depressed or despondent in that third quarter. Some people think the fourth quarter is important before they come down. So time can play a role, and it seems to be individualized to different astronauts.
And how much of an astronaut's day is spent like working? I mean, how much time do you have to play the guitar if you
Well, they have officially 8 hours of rest and sleep. And the rest of the day is work. They exercise about 2 hours a day, which keeps them physically fit in microgravity. You got to keep your muscles and your bones working. You lose bone mass, and you lose muscle atrophy, and you lose your immune system a bit in space. So exercising a couple hours is important to keep yourself toned. So that's the rest of the time. Now, having said that, a lot of the astronauts will, there used to be a job jar, but I think it's a virtual job jar. When they have some time at night, they'll find another job to do, or they'll end the experiments because they choose to. But that's their official free time, where they, after dinner, can do what they want to do.
Well, and you mentioned exercise. So that also helps with it would seem, their mental health as well.
Yeah.
It would seem like,
Yeah, it does. I think it does help them feel kind of in tune and pitched, and it can be a very good countermeasure. Now, there are also some interpersonal stuff that happens. I think we have some slides for that.
Yes.
You have a crew, and crews these days are very heterogeneous. You see here a crew. You have different races, different countries. There's a couple Russians, a Canadian in this slide, different sexes. So the crews are very heterogeneous, and so they have to be trained and accepting of different cultural backgrounds in terms of food, in terms of how they communicate, and so on. So language is also important. Usually language, if you're launched from America, it's English. If you're launched from Russia, it's Russian. So a common language, at least to be able to speak it in terms of emergencies and dealing with things, is quite important. So they all learn a couple of languages before they go up. The next slide, I think, it shows crews getting along with each other. Here, this is actually a changeover in crews, but it reminds us that there can be some conflicts. You might get along great for a few months with anybody, but then the jokes aren't so funny after a while, and occasionally people separate and get into their own space a bit to kind of get away. So personality is really important of the crew. The crew ground communication is really important.
I can imagine too that the job jar kind of plays into that. Like if everyone's at least doing a little bit of extra work, maybe it helps with that camaraderie as well.
Yeah, especially if you're working on someone else's experiment.
Right, yeah.
It helps a lot.
Sort of helping people out.
But right now there's a big they call synchronous link between crew and ground. That means they can talk almost in real time. And so you depend a lot on the ground for advice, and they send directions of different tasks to do. So there's a give and take between it. So the crew ground communication is really very important. And then finally, leadership. We studied leadership in our study, and we found that those commanders that were felt to be supportive really were very instrumental in having a crew that rated high in cohesion. So a supportive commander as well as a taskmaster are really important. I'll mention one thing: when crews are tense, sometimes, and they can't deal with it in space, they sometimes displace it to the ground. You all know what that is. When your boss tells you to do something and you don't like it, you can't tell them off, so you go home and you yell at your wife or your kids or your partner, and that's displacing of tension from the person that should be going to, but to someone else. So that's an important issue that mission control needs to think about.
Well, and you were saying that you spoke to not just cosmonauts and astronauts and people who went up, but also to mission control specialists and people who were working on the ground.
Yes, we studied them as well. It's another group involved with space travel, those mission control teams.
Well, very good. So actually, I should have noted, and I apologize for not saying it earlier, that if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the Facebook chat, and we'll take a couple moments here to answer some of those. I guess we have our first one going to a physiological question rather than a psychological, but asking about sort of bone and muscle loss. How much?
Well, it used to be about 1% a month, and it's a lot less now because they exercise. It's not zero, but it's less than 1%. So they've done fairly well in a short mission. Now, we don't know about going to Mars. I can talk about Mars later if you want.
Right. We'll get on that.
Mars is 2.5 years, and what we don't know is you have 7 months going to Mars, so you lose a little bone and atrophy in a muscle. We don't know if the partial gravity of Mars is restorative or not.
Yeah.
A third of Earth gravity, 38%. And then you come back another 7 months. So what we don't know is whether you kind of regain some of that while being on Mars for a while, and then you come back. We know that astronauts can survive up to 14 months in space. The Russians have had 6 people, I think, who've made it a year plus, and we've had 1. We know you can make 14 months in microgravity with exercise. The fellow that made 14 months was a physician, and he was very diligent about exercising, so he came back in good shape.
Well, and so, we have another question here. So how do they deal with medical or psychiatric emergencies on the International Space Station?
Well, they do pretty well with that in terms of the medical. They have a lot of discussions with the ground, and they can kind of cope with things there. More and more, they have learned strategies of doing minor surgical operations in a microgravity environment. There's a lot of interest in that. Again, going to Mars, where you have a lot of autonomy and you aren't going to be able to talk in real time to the ground in dealing with these emergencies all by yourself without any help from the ground. So there's a lot of discussion about how best can we train the crews and give them packages of things to do for, say, surgery. Psychiatrically, again, crews have done pretty well. I can talk a little bit about the psychiatric issues. Typically, astronauts have adjustment reactions first getting up there. They get maybe transiently a little depressed or a little bit nervous about being there, and then they adjust very easily. The Russians have a syndrome they call asthenization, like the old neurasthenia diagnosis used to be a psychiatric condition, but they don't see it that way. They see it as an adjustment where people get fatigued and irritable, and so they can deal with that by having them talk to their family or friends or kind of cope in that way. We haven't seen a significant mood or psychotic disorders like hallucinations or delusions. There have been some reports occasionally of hallucinations that are transient, but nothing major because they're screened very well. And these are bipolar and schizophrenia are biological disorders largely and are heavily weighted that way anyway. And so astronauts are screened away from that. There is the issue. There's some positive effects in space as well. I mean, really, the astronauts. I think you have some slides of that we can show a little later.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later about the beauty of the Earth and so on. I can talk a little bit about that later.
The overview effect is something.
Yeah. But people like to see the Earth, and it's really important. And so that's something that they choose to do when they're free time, is to go and look down at the Earth from their cupola.
Right. Well, actually, and we sort of talked, one more question. So were the findings of the study used to change procedures in the astronauts' lives on the stations, or are these studies ongoing?
I like to think that what we did for 15 years was helpful. I know that it affected training because I communicate a lot with the trainers, the psychological support staff in America. And I know that their training has incorporated a lot of these ideas. And so that means the astronauts are thinking more and more about some of these psychological issues. When we first started our studies, they were very skeptical because they didn't like psychiatrists and psychologists because they knew them in the past as people that could ground you. And as researchers, we took a lot of care in keeping our research blind and not identifying individuals. So gradually, I think the trust got built. So I think that helped as well.
Well, and we've talked about some of the stressors, but maybe it would be good to talk about some of the ways of dealing with that stress, because I think that's obviously an important part as well.
Yeah, I think one of the areas is to kind of keep things as normal as you can, and to follow traditions, celebrate birthdays, celebrate events that occur, taking care of grooming. Here you see an astronaut cutting another's hair.
Mm-hmm.
So grooming is important, and trying to normalize as much as possible in what you do. I mentioned also looking out the window. I think we have a picture. There it is. Here's a cupola. There's a cupola on the space station where the astronauts can go and take a look at the Earth and get mesmerized about the beauty of the Earth. We did a study of positive effects of being in space, and the only major significant positive effect that really struck us all was them talking about the beauty of the Earth, that humans are all one species, we're all together, there's no natural boundaries, and how beautiful it is. And astronauts love to see the Earth and love to look at it. And I think that's a major issue in relieving stress and helping them cope better. There's a 24/7 communication with family and friends these days, so you can talk to anyone you want to get relief. I think they have a lot of positive messaging going on in space as well to keep the astronauts functioning. Most of the astronauts just love to be there, so they're happy as can be to be flying. Here you see some reentry issues. That's important to think about.
Right.
They'll come back. They have to get together with their family and friends. This is an earlier mission where you have the poor astronauts in isolation for a while, staring glumly out at their wives because they can't really get out there and see them. That's gotten better. And so I think these are all important coping strategies that help boost morale of the astronauts.
Well, I mean, I left this image a little too fast, I think, but you talk about looking out the window, and I mentioned in passing this idea of the overview effect. Is that like do you personally buy into that what some people have talked about is this sort of shift in perspective that happens for people
we've actually studied that and taken a look at that, and I think we have found that many astronauts really do come back with a more humanistic view of things. They come back, they get involved with foundations, or they start being more involved with other cultural things involving other people. And I think the notion of seeing the Earth as not a political entity, but as a beautiful entity that's home for all of us is really important psychologically. It's not just what a pretty picture, it's the sense of what it means to you. And I think the notion of an overview effect is real and certainly is important in missions where you can see the Earth. Again, we don't know about going to Mars because the Earth is not so significant anymore.
Right. Well, on that topic, since we've mentioned about going to Mars a couple times, I guess first of all, let me just check and see if there were any other questions before we just start to leave Earth. But the question is, would modern day submariners provide good case studies for furthering long-term space exploration?
A lot of studies before they are ready to go to flight are done in simulation. And submarines have been used, as has other kinds of environments are pretty good. The better ones are probably these days the Antarctic missions, especially small missions,
Right.
because they're so long. Submarine missions tend to be briefer. They're year long, some of the Antarctic. And then they have simulators at NASA, Russia, Europe, China, where they actually simulate tasks and duties. And so those are better because they're designed to be simulation of space. So everything is potentially useful. In the early days, submarines were seen as a wonderful simulation, but nowadays we have better simulators to test out ideas before flying them.
Well, so we've kind of pulled away from our location at the International Space Station. So I just wanted to cue us up to talk about traveling to Mars, because I think one of the things that's really challenging is that, you know, like I said, this is as high as humans go out into space right now, a few hundred kilometers away from Earth. I also like that we happen to emerge with the South Pole at the top of the image, because it's a great reminder that there's no up in space. But I just wanted to pull away, and what we reveal here is this this sort of arc around Earth is actually the orbit of the moon, and that's as far as humans have ever traveled out into space. So as we talk about going to Mars, how much did we learn from the Apollo program as well, or do you think the ISS has really been a more of an instruction opportunity for us?
I think the ISS has been good. We studied crews on the Mir, which was a Russian space station, first. And then when that was deorbited in favor of the ISS, and we studied crews on the ISS. I think those are the best simulators because they actually, for a Mars mission.
Right.
Because they have danger and microgravity, which nothing on Earth really has. There are some submersibles where you have a time when you're outside swimming where you're kind of light, and you have to have, you know, oxygen, and you have to have that apparatus to protect yourself. So those aren't bad. Those undersea submersibles are also good simulators. But the ISS is a wonderful simulator of most of the things that you do on a Mars trip. We're, I think, looking ahead, going to Mars. For the best thing to do would be to simulate in an ISS environment going out, and then landing on the moon and using the moon as a simulator for being on Mars, which is the current Artemis program of getting us to be based on the moon. Because then you have microgravity, you've got something solid to be on, you can hit real rocks in a non-air environment. That's a wonderful simulation. And then coming back, you can simulate again on the ISS or some other capsule as well.
So our producer Mary is tipping her hand and asking if the spacecraft that's going to be used to travel to Mars, is that going to be much bigger or smaller than the International Space Station?
It'll be smaller, and well, it depends. The space agency proposal is to have a capsule that sends, I think, 4 people. That's like a super Apollo going to Mars. It's not quite as cramped as Apollo, but it's not as big as the space station. And so that plan right now includes that. The private companies, Musk's program, for example, has a much bigger vehicle, and he actually has a group of people. I've seen up to 100 or 200 in a huge space going with the idea of colonizing.
Right.
So it depends on who you're talking to, but the agency programs tend to be of the super, they call it Apollo on steroids. And that could change. I personally think crews of 6 or 7 are better than 4 from a purely psychological side. You have more variants of people to talk to. You've got probably having men and women, but everyone's got a buddy, maybe 2 women, 3 women rather than 1. You have more people to give and take. So I would hope by the time we get closer to Mars, there might be some increase in size of the capsule and increase in size of the crew. But right now it's 4. Artemis gets us to the moon, and it creates a staging ground to send the ship outward to Mars.
And I kind of, already sort of moved beyond Artemis here because we've now left the Earth-Moon system. And just to give a sense, I mean, again, the farthest humans have traveled is kind of these few pixels down here at the center, the 400,000 kilometers, 240,000 miles to the moon. But if we're talking about Mars, we've got Mercury, Venus is kind of off screen, Earth, Mars, the fourth planet out, much, much farther away from us than the moon, and much farther away, of course, than the International Space Station. So how long is the trip out to Mars?
Right now, with the current chemical propulsion systems, it's about, and then they do a little flyby where they get a little boost. It's about 7 months one way.
Okay. And so we're going to do that a lot faster because we're flying through a digital universe. So
yeah,
we're going to sort of zoom up on Mars here. So what are so 7 months there, and then how long would people typically be spending on the Martian surface?
There's a number of scenarios, but it could be up to about a year. I mean, you're going to go a long way. You might as well take advantage of it. So the whole mission they're thinking about is 2 to 2.5 years.
Okay. And so that's even longer than any individual has spent on in microgravity and Earth orbit.
Correct.
Wow.
The microgravity part is less because it's 7 months versus 14 months.
Right.
The question is, how restorative is the 38% Earth gravity on Mars going to be?
Well, then, and I think we had a couple talking points for this area as well. As well, since this is a longer trip, there may be some additional kind of ways to help the astronauts out on the journey.
Yeah, the same old thing I mentioned earlier is to try and keep things as normalized as possible with the Earth. Celebrate each other's holidays, birthdays, events. The problem with Mars is a couple of new stressors, though. One is the extreme distance and isolation that one feels being that far away from Earth. Unlike the moon, you can't see a beautiful orbit of the Earth, and also the communication delay. The extreme is up to 44 minutes round trip. So if you ask a question, "How are the kids, dear?" you have to wait up to 44 minutes to get an answer. Now that's if the two planets are on other side of the sun in orbits, but it can still be 20 minutes or so under normal conditions. So you can't talk to anyone and get support or deal with emergencies in real time. The crew can be very autonomous. They'll have to kind of plan their own schedule and do their own thing, which could create a blessing or a curse for the crews, and probably a curse for mission control. What are you going to do in mission control where your operation shifts from directing traffic and communicating all the time to sort of waiting for responses? So the task of mission control will have to be looked at and will have to shift as well.
So with the ISS then, mission control is really doing more of that scheduling work and figuring out what people are doing day to day?
Yeah, it's almost instantaneous. I think the moon is about 3-second time delay and the ISS is a second. So it's almost instantaneous or synchronous. It'll be different. They'll have to operate differently. These guys will have to figure out a way of doing that. I think we have a picture. Let's see the next. That's Mars.
Yes. Sorry, did you want me to go back? I
think you have a picture of the Earth, and
yes, I do.
There's another psychological thing that nobody really knows what to make of. Here's the way the Earth looks from the moon. So it's still a beautiful orb. We still have a sense of home, and in fact, to date, except maybe for a brief time on the other side of the moon, no human being has ever experienced the Earth other than being a significant part of their lives. They're either on the Earth, under the Earth, in the water, or looking at the Earth. On Mars, the Earth becomes quite different, and I think you have a picture of the expanse of the Earth from Mars.
So I can actually sort of turn the camera to face Earth from Mars. Yeah. And it's not quite the same experience, is it?
Where'd it go?
We could put up a marker to show you.
There it is.
It's a tiny little blue dot.
I call this the disappearing Earth phenomenon, or the Earth out of view. It's kind of technically in view, but it's an insignificant dot in the heaven. So what does that mean psychologically to people who are accustomed to thinking of their home planet as home. And I mentioned earlier, our studies have showed how important as a support seeing the Earth is to crews. Now they can't see the Earth except as an insignificant dot. So psychologically, that could have a big impact on the crews. Probably the idea is to have a telescope on board or virtual reality where they can still experience the Earth as an orb. But nevertheless, we need to really think seriously about what to do about this issue.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I'll just pause here for a moment to see if we have any other questions coming up. And it looks like I have a good question about if there are enough materials on the moon to set up manufacturing and then use that as a basis of moving to Mars.
Well, the moon was, for a while, was thought it was kind of disappointing. There wasn't a lot of exciting minerals there, according to the moon rocks, that would make it worthwhile. Now we're finding there is some water that's located in the shadowy craters, and there is the ability to make, with minimal components, to make fuels and to generate oxygen and to do things on Mars. And so we're now seeing the planets as not only getting minerals, but other capabilities to move along. So I think that the sense is that probably the moon will be a staging area more than anything, and we'll have some water so the crews can at least chemically shift the water with some elements they bring to make more fuel and do things with that for the next stage. One thing I didn't mention is about going to not the moon but Mars is, what if they find life? What if they find, we know that there's water on Mars in the polar caps and probably subsurface, not too far down even. And so if we find microbial life or some elements of life, psychologically, what is that going to do not only to the astronauts but to all of us?
Very interesting. Well, I don't know if we have any other questions coming in from Facebook, but I guess one thing that certainly comes to mind, and I think we even heard from a few astronauts when sort of lockdowns were first starting to happen back in March and April, but sort of what it means to live in isolation and the psychological effects of that. So do you think there are some lessons we can take from your work to think about living in isolation as some
well, I think so. I think there's some tips that we can gain. The first one, of course, we can do, they can't do, which is take a walk outside, and casually. And I think the notion of seeing nature, though, and being involved with the Earth, again, takes us back to the beauty of the Earth and the overview. And I think that's important for astronauts and probably important for us to just get outside, preferably into a park or an area where we're socially distanced and masked, but we can experience nature and animals. And I think that's very supportive. And just like the astronauts like the Earth, we like the Earth too. They talk to family and friends daily now because they have relay systems and they can do things like that. So I think contacting your family and your friends, we now have Zoom, which is a wonderful, and other platforms. I don't want to plug Zoom only, but, we have other platforms of seeing people and communicating. Personally, we use it a lot in our family because we can see grandkids and family frequently on Zoom. So if you have the technology to connect with other people, that's really important. These kinds of presentations you're giving at the Academy is really critical to get people a little bit outside of themselves and keep their minds going. Which also, the third thing, structuring your day. Scott Kelly, his advice, he was asked about that, and he said he structures his day. And that's really important, to have some kind of a plan of what I'm going to do today, whatever it is that you like. Right. And speaking of what you like, use this opportunity to do what you love. Form a hobby, start something new, read some new books you normally wouldn't read. It's a good opportunity to do that. I'm actually writing a lot of papers because I'm home, and it gives me time to read and write papers. And my wife and I both look at Zoom all the time and take courses. You can do that. So I think that helps you keep mentally alert. Respecting privacy is important. The astronauts like to get away from each other and for little breaks. And just because your family or your partner or your kids need privacy doesn't mean they don't love you. It means they need privacy. So respecting people having their own space periodically and doing their own thing is really important. And then they come back and join you for other times like meals. finally having regular discussions. We kind of are pushing because of displacement and letting tensions fester and build. We feel it's important that people sit down periodically and just ask how they're doing with each other. Not in a way where someone's angry. That's not the time to do it. But maybe build in periodically and say, well, how are we getting along? Can we do something? Am I doing something that bothers you? Can I improve things a bit? That takes some of the pressure off in a calm way and avoids the festering of the tension and maybe some anger that could occur. So the astronauts do this, and we find that the mission control realize sometimes astronauts are angry at them, not for what they're doing, but for what they're feeling on board. And so understanding that helps a lot as well.
So we don't at home have mission control to take it out on, but maybe we have others in our lives that might come under fire.
Yeah, you don't want to make a phone call to somebody who you love and yell at the phone at them, yell through the phone at them. If it's something that you are doing, you're feeling yourself.
Well, I don't know if we have any more questions coming through, but if not, I actually had a question. And maybe since Mary has already revealed that she's the magician behind the curtains, if we can bring up this image of Earth, our kind of digital image of Earth. I guess one question I have is, and I've had some conversations about this with people who work in planetariums, and of course, this is not quite the same thing doing this on a Facebook page, but in a dome, we've kind of wondered, is there a way to maybe digitally reproduce that overview effect for people to kind of bring people into this shared space, look at this beautiful Earth imagery, and maybe foster a connection through this digital representation of Earth? So I'm just curious, as a closing thought, if that has any traction for you. Do you think that there's some merit to that?
Oh, no, I think so. I mentioned a telescope earlier that would help you see the Earth at least maybe a little bit of a delay for the light to get to you. But virtual reality has been the closest thing people have done to this. And I think digital or virtual reality can help a lot. Astronauts like to look at things. Some of them have diaries where they, booklets where they can see family photos and things, and it reminds them of the Earth and kind of allows them to kind of relive it. Certainly, I think digital or virtual reality programs can help a lot with that as well. So I think that's a technology that can be a great assistance.
Very good. Then I guess that's what we have to work with right now. So we're going to keep trying to share our virtual space and Earth voyages with our audiences. I want to thank you once again, Nick, for joining us for today's Cosmic Conversation, and thank you everyone on Facebook who's either watching this live or is watching it as a pre-recorded event. But thanks. Have a great.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right.